Good afternoon, everybody. That was simply an incredible talk involving some digital archaeology that's actually taken us right the way back into the 90s from Tom and Danny and Costin and Juan. Just mind-blowing stuff. I'm going to stick with a little bit of the same sort of historical theme, but focused on something that takes us back into the slightly more recent past. So throughout 2016, we got called to deal with some APT intrusions, which had a slightly more interesting twist than we first expected whenever our incident response team got called in. We lit up a few instances of PlugX in the networks that we were looking at, and our Intel team mapped those back pretty quickly into a very large set of C2 infrastructure that overlapped in dozens of locations with a very well-documented set of historical activity. The very first instance of that historical activity was back in 2009 with a malware sample that contained what would turn out to be actually a pretty well-known phrase. That phrase, menu pass, was the poison ivy password used by the malware sample to communicate with its C2 server, and was the first of more than 30 samples containing that password used by this actor over the next 4 years, along with about 90 other samples using 7 or so other passwords. So that actor, known as CVNX, based on some of their very early subdomains, potentially even going as far back as 2007, was also known as Stone Panda by CrowdStrike and APT10 by FireEye. And actually, a lot of that historical activity from 2009 through to 2013 was thoroughly documented by FireEye in their 2013 report titled Assessing Damage and Extracting Intelligence. So, that's kind of a little bit of the background on where this activity links to. And a lot of people thought actually following that report, the group had gone to ground because their poison ivy usage tailed off pretty dramatically. So I've got about 20 minutes to fill you in on some of the stuff that the group has been up to since then. So as we continued our investigations and we kept mapping out some of the infrastructure, we found PlugX, and we found more PlugX, and we found more PlugX. And a lot of what we found was effectively delivered using load order hijacking or side loading. And a lot of the samples from 2014 and 2015 were all wrapped using security products. So we've got Microsoft Security Essentials, McAfee Antivirus Enterprise, VBA32 Anti-Root Kit, GData Antivirus Kit, and a whole load of similar kind of security products. And for the most part, the file names of the encoded blobs that contained the PlugX payload actually were generally blended in with the nature of the application that was being hijacked. But as we got towards the end of 2015 and into 2016, there was a bit of a shift away from that into more arbitrary applications, and actually the names of the encoded payloads seemed to be completely random as well, almost as if they were being picked from some sort of English language word list. And for a while, they really loved the Brazilian language version of the Poker Stars binary. I don't quite know what the connection is with that, but they really liked that for a while. But we saw that shift to kind of arbitrary word lists in some other aspects of their operation as well, which I'll come back to in a bit. So in total, we found something in the region of about 30 PlugX side-loaded variants that these guys were using. Some of those have been used by other APT groups as well, like APT26, and some of them we think are pretty exclusive to this group. We also saw them taking some open source tools like pwdump and Mimikatz and actually side-loading those as well. So there was a particular version of Mimikatz that we found a couple of instances of, which had some very curious error messages that the developer had put into the source code. And there are a few other kind of sassy notes into this that I couldn't actually get away with putting on the slide. The interesting bit about this for me is the language that the dev has used. So the fact that they don't view themselves as an A-team hacker yet, but seem to feel fortunate they're giving that sort of opportunity is quite interesting. And the fact that they have bosses seems like they're in some sort of formal working environment where some sort of on-the-job training is available. So it's quite interesting to see them deliver some of this stuff with sideloading as well. So the PlugX usage brings us up to 2016, which actually marks a very significant shift in the group's operational scale and the capability. Prior to that, they were using mostly Poison Ivy and then PlugX, and they didn't really demonstrate any end-to-end development capability themselves. But in mid to late 2016, APT10 began a parallel espionage operation focused almost exclusively on Japanese targets and potentially some Korean targets as well. And the malware at the center of that campaign is called Chichez by JPCert, who wrote a blog about it in January this year. It was actually named after the fact that some of the malware samples contain icons from Chinese chess sets. Most of them contain icons from Microsoft Word and some other things that are fairly common. But it's actually a fairly straightforward backdoor. Relatively limited functionality, kind of fingerprinting, and kind of basic foothold functionality. But it can and has been used to pull down other commands as well, particularly PowerShell commands. Most of the kind of 70-odd samples that we've looked at were signed by the hack team certificate from that 2015 breach, which at this stage is a pretty good indication of something that's bad. And some of the samples link to 2 other projects. I won't go into them in any depth, but they're called Bypass AV, which is a wrapper that seems to be designed to do what it says on the tin, and Black DLL, which is a loader named after some of the DLL exports that was used in a couple of instances to launch the Chichez malware. But has also been used to launch another kind of bundle of malware that we call NetEaseX, that we've only seen used to target Chinese-speaking individuals through social engineering scams. We actually don't know if that's APT10 or not. The targeting using Chichez seemed to be extremely narrow and very much focused on politics and diplomatic side of things, like foreign relations between Japan, US, China, etc., as well as policy and research things. Again, it's particular organizations focused in health, etc. And some of that targeting is pretty obvious based on the names of the file names, which we've translated here from Japanese. I actually had to be pretty selective about which ones we put up here, because some of the file names are almost too long to fit on screen. They're almost like an executive summary of the actual lure itself, which was a bit of an interesting technique in its own right. There are loads of other examples of this, and a lot of them can be linked to stuff that was quite topical at the time. And particularly in the kind of geopolitical sense, there's plenty of ammo for that sort of stuff at the minute. So you've got things like the disputed ownership of the Senkaku Islands, you've got President Trump's meeting with Prime Minister Abe in Japan, and things like the floundering Trans-Pacific Partnership, just to kind of give 3 examples of that sort of thing. The developers were also a little bit, or kind of inadvertently helpful in this. They actually left a bunch of printf debug statements in some of the malware. So whenever you ran it from, or in console mode, you actually got a pretty good narrative of what it was doing behind the scenes, which turned out to be quite helpful in some cases. So thank you, APT10 guys, for that. But despite their shiny new implant, a lot of the delivery vector was reminiscent of some of their 2009 to 2013 activity, where actually they were just spear phishing people with the exe directly attached to the email, or inside a zip file of the same name. So that obviously wasn't having the degree of success that they wanted. So they added another layer into this. And in January 2017, they began spear phishing with link attachments. So this was actually a link file that kicked off some PowerShell, which then got redirected through a goo.go URL shortener to the C2 server, where it grabbed some more PowerShell, which then launched the Chichez malware into memory. And they seem to have a little bit more success with this. But because of the regional targeting of this, JPCert, again, had pretty good visibility of it and blogged about it in early February this year. One of the obvious targets of this was the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for which APT10 registered a couple of pretty similar domains. And one of those was actually used to host a scanbox profiler as well on the anzin.mofa.go.jp.com address. We don't actually have the telemetry of which sites were compromised to host that, so if anybody happens to know that, please come and talk to me afterwards. We'd be really interested in figuring that stuff out. And just another data point on the targeting, goo.go helpfully makes the public stats, or makes the stats of the redirects public. So we took a look at one of them just a few days after it was set up by the attackers. And at this stage, the font's pretty small, but Japan is responsible for close on 50% of all of the clicks to it to date. The rest, Western Europe, Nordics, US, and Canada, which is probably quite heavily focused on security researchers like us that were doing a bit of investigation into this stuff. 2016 also brought a new malware family. Very helpfully, JPCert just published a new blog on this morning, which is quite timely. Like most of the PlugX activity, this was Red Leaves, which is actually named after one of the encoded strings in the payload for default exe, is delivered through sideloading. But in contrast to the Chichez malware, we're back now on Western targeting. Red Leaves itself is actually a pretty slick piece of kit. It's a really nice foothold, very comprehensive fingerprinting of the user and the operating system, credential theft, file operations, proxy, tunneling, shell, session enumeration, screen capture, all the sort of good stuff that an operator might need. They also, the developer actually seems to know what they're doing as well. So quite a lot of the functionality is actually multi-threaded. And one of the decoded mutex strings at the bottom, Red Leaves CMD simulator mutex, is what's actually used to synchronize activity across those threads as well. In 2017, in January, we also saw APT10 trying out the open source .NET Quasar rat, and they'd actually built a really nice loader for this. So what they've actually done, and they kick off the loader with the legit install util file, but they have a heavily obfuscated .NET binary, which looks for, effectively, it has a hard-coded directory and recursively enumerates every file in that directory over 300K, attempts to AES decode that and then launch it as a .NET assembly. And obviously the exception handling around it will prevent any errors. So you've got the loader, which it can be dropped anywhere, completely kind of independent of where they place the payloads. We've also seen loaders that are several months older than the payloads that they're using, so it shows that you can actually swap this stuff out, or swap out the payloads very easily and keep the loader the same. And we've seen the actors actually do that on 3 occasions within a 24-hour period to fix some of the OPSEC mistakes that they'd made in the config files of the Quasar rat, which is actually encoded in the DAT file. So that's a rapid-fire overview of some of the malware families they've been using. There's a little bit of evil grab usage in there as well, but we haven't gone into that in any depth. But just to give a walkthrough of this, October 2013 is effectively the first set of PlugX samples that we can link to this group. That continues all the way through 2014, 2015, and 2016. And then we have the Chichez malware appearing in September 2016 through until the end of the year as a standalone version. It's now being launched using PowerShell from January 2017. But at the start of this year, we also saw them using the Red Leaves implant and the Quasar malware as well, although we've got some indications the Red Leaves might have actually been in use a little bit before that too. So if we take a look at some of the compile times of this malware, so focused on PlugX, Quasar, and Red Leaves so far, this is all UTC +8. You generally get a standard kind of working day in there. There's a few exceptions on it, but generally it's a standard kind of China Standard Time working day. The reason I've left Chichez out of this is that if you look at the compile time for that, it shows a very different picture. So we've either got an out-of-hours project, we've got timestamps that are being tinkered, or we've got development happening somewhere else. But all of the C2 infrastructure associated with this campaign, we'll come back to in a sec, is again within China Standard Time. So actually, let's take a quick look at some of the infrastructure. These are a few of the domains they registered in the back half of 2016. Some pretty common themes coming out, a bit of religious themes, a bit of political themes, a bit of international stuff as well. You can see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs stuff there that I was talking about earlier. But if we look at the subdomains that hang off these, we also get some really interesting themes. There are a lot of subdomains that are Japanese cities. A lot of them are land-based things, so flea, lizard, scorpion, lion, foal, zebra, etc. Some sea-based stuff, shrimp, trout, whale, and then a whole lot of people's names as well. And there are actually a lot of other things here that are either kind of regionally focused or topic focused, again, on some things like health. And there's a remarkably consistent naming structure with the dynamic DNS domains that these guys were using as well, which increased exponentially throughout 2016 and 2017. Now, whoever was setting those up in hundreds of instances used very similar terms, all to do with sort of IT management. So it's things like MS Update, Windows Update, download, IPv4, IPv6, etc. So they've obviously got somebody that's following a pretty standard routine for this stuff. And again, looking at the domain registrations, as I mentioned, there's a pretty consistent working pattern. This is UTC, so you can see there's a burst, then a break, then another burst. But if we swing this round to UTC +8 and look at it in a slightly different way, we've got a very clear picture that between 8 a.m. in the morning and 12 p.m., there's most of the activity, then a break for 2 hours, and then starting from 1400 through to 1800 again, there's another burst of activity. And notably, none of this happened on a Saturday or Sunday. So who have these guys actually been targeting? Well, for the most part, all the usual suspects. We've got a lot of energy and mining, engineering, construction, metals, industrial manufacturing, a bit of business and professional services, a bit around telcos, particularly in Asia, retail and consumer, and pharma and life sciences a little bit more recently. And obviously then the Chichez stuff we've already talked about that was targeting Japan. And they've actually been doing this on a pretty broad scale. So we've got USA, Canada, Brazil on one side, we've got South Korea, Japan, and Australia on another, and then there's been quite a lot of activity in Europe, and particularly the Nordics as well. So for a group that a lot of people thought had disappeared in 2013, how have these guys actually been staying under the radar? Well, this is where we think it actually gets quite interesting. So during 2016, and potentially as early as 2014, APT10 were heavily targeting IT managed services providers. Now, these folks obviously have hot boxes on the client networks that they manage. They have legit domain admin access to the client networks. And we've observed multiple MSPs being used as both an entry route to those customer networks, as well as part of the exfil path. And APT10 has actually crafted a really quite interesting web of exfil paths to be able to move data around the world. And the compromise of some of these MSPs potentially would have given APT10 access to thousands of victim networks. And the fact that they were able to move data between MSP customers and across MSPs themselves has probably been pretty instrumental in helping them avoid a lot of public reporting over the last few years. So to give a very quick example of this, we've got the actor using PlugX directly over the internet into a compromised MSP client network, using that to push data out of the client network back into the MSP that manages that client, transferred from that MSP over to another client of a different MSP, then back into that MSP's network, and then back out to a location that the actor is able to get it. So that's just one example. But on a much larger scale, this actually becomes quite complex because you've got webs of MSPs that have interconnections with each other. You have victims that are being used to push data back and forward. And actually, you end up with quite a complex kind of picture to piece together whenever you're dealing with multiple intrusions of this nature. The actor as well seemed to keep a quite tight eye on what's being said about them. So a quick kind of walk through some of that stuff. August 2013, I've already talked about FireEye's assessing damage and extracting intel report. A couple of months later, in August 2013, we saw the first instances of PlugX that we can tie to this group. 26th of January, I mentioned JPCert published a Chichez blog. 2nd of February, APT10 registered jpcert.org. I'd be quite interested if anybody has seen that used. Again, we don't have the telemetry on it yet. 10th of February was the JPCert blog about PowerShell and Chichez, and within a couple of weeks, a new sample of the PowerShell script hit VirusTotal that showed a whole load of evasion techniques built into it. On the same day, Cylance published a blog on what they called snake wine, which is exactly the same stuff. They detailed quite a lot about the domain registration habits of the actor, which were primarily to use India.com and Yandex.com email addresses, and then the ITH name servers. And a few days after that, we saw a wholesale shift away from that registration pattern, which they stuck to consistently for months, over to using privacyguardian.org registration with childrenstow.com, which was the first C2 of it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in April 2017, because as I mentioned, JP sort of just put a new blog up on it. In a few minutes, we are releasing a joint publication with BAE Systems on some of this activity, and the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK has been helping us coordinate outreach to some of the affected organizations and victims, and we're expecting quite a significant uptick in some of the public reporting on these guys as well. So, just to wrap up, based on way more than I can fit in a 25-minute talk, we have extremely high confidence that the activity from 2014 to 2017 using PlugX, Quasar, Red Leaves, and Chichez is being conducted by the same actor as was responsible for the 2009 to 2013 menu pass activity, namely APT10. A couple of other things that are quite interesting around their ability to, or they seem to have quite ready access to native language linguists, particularly in Japanese, English, and potentially Korean as well. The scale of their retooling and development through 2016 shows that they've got multiple in-house developers or access to a digital quartermaster that's helping them. and their ability to manage multiple campaigns and the scale of victims that they've been collecting stuff from in 2016 as well is remarkably different than their previous activity. And so we actually think they probably absorbed some teams that are familiar with C&E operations. And we think that's pretty likely to continue. So just to wrap up, I guess we've gone from, in 2009, with APT10 or menu pass, to give them their original name, being little more than, I guess, a pimple on the hairy arse of commercial espionage, through to a major player who's compromised multiple networks, giving them access to potentially thousands of high-value targets, which is also a pretty stark reminder for all of us that we really need to be looking at our supply chains, not just those that are responsible for our own kind of corporate networks, but also the folks that are managing kind of hybrid cloud and public cloud environments on our behalves as well. And given that's exactly where John Lambert's going to pick up in the next talk, that's exactly where I'm going to finish. Thank you.